The autumn mist clung to the rolling hills of Kentucky like a shroud, and Martha Whitmore pulled her woolen shawl tighter as she hurried down the muddy path toward the settlement. The year 1799 had brought an unusually harsh October, and the trees stood bare against the grey sky, their skeletal branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Behind her, the small cabin she shared with her husband Samuel seemed to grow smaller with each step, swallowed by the encroaching wilderness. Martha's heart hammered against her ribs as she recalled the conversation she'd overheard the night before. Samuel had been speaking in hushed tones with their neighbor Thomas Creek, their voices barely audible through the thin cabin walls. But she had caught enough words to freeze her blood. Harpe brothers, missing children, and most chilling of all, the old Brennan Ranch. The settlement of Cedar Hollow consisted of no more than 20 families scattered across the rugged landscape, each carving out their existence from the unforgiving frontier. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where news traveled faster than wildfire, and where certain subjects were spoken of only in whispers, if at all. As Martha approached the general store, she noticed the unusual quiet that had settled over the small cluster of buildings. Normally, children would be playing in the dirt roads, their laughter echoing off the wooden structures. Today, the silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of an axe biting into wood and the occasional lowing of cattle. Inside the store, she found Eleanor Brennan hunched over the counter, her weathered hands gripping a cup of steaming coffee as if it were her lifeline. Eleanor's eyes, once bright and welcoming, now held a haunted quality that made Martha's stomach churn. The woman had aged a decade in the past month, her auburn hair now streaked with premature grey, her face etched with lines of worry and fear. "Eleanor," Martha said softly, approaching the counter. "How are you holding up?" Eleanor's head snapped up, and for a moment her eyes darted toward the door as if expecting someone to burst through. "Martha," she whispered, her voice hoarse, "you shouldn't be here. None of us should be talking about what happened." "But we have to talk about it," Martha insisted, leaning closer. "Little Sarah Jenkins disappeared 3 days ago. That makes 4 children in 2 months. 4, Eleanor. And everyone's acting like it's just normal." Eleanor's hands trembled as she set down her coffee cup. The ceramic clinked against the wooden counter, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet store. "You don't understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My husband, before he died, he told me things. Things about those men who've been seen around the old ranch, things that would make your blood run cold." Martha felt a chill run down her spine. The old Brennan Ranch had been abandoned for nearly a year, ever since Eleanor's husband had died under mysterious circumstances. The official story was that he'd fallen from his horse and broken his neck, but there had always been whispers of something more sinister. "What kind of things?" Martha pressed, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. Eleanor glanced around the empty store once more, then leaned across the counter until her face was inches from Martha's. "He saw them," she whispered. "The Harpe brothers, Micajah and Wiley. They'd been using the old ranch as a base. My husband saw them bringing people there, travelers who never made it to their destinations. And children." Her voice broke. "God help us, Martha. He saw them bringing children." The words hit Martha like a physical blow. She had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in Kentucky had heard whispers about the Harpe brothers. They were said to be the most ruthless killers on the frontier, men who murdered not for money or land, but for the sheer pleasure of it. But those had always seemed like campfire tales, stories told to frighten children into staying close to home. "Why hasn't anyone done anything?" Martha asked, though she already knew the answer. Eleanor's laugh was bitter and hollow. "Who would we tell? The nearest law is 3 days' ride, and even if we could get word to them, who would believe us? Besides," she lowered her voice even further, "there are those in town who think it's better to stay quiet. Better to let sleeping dogs lie than to risk bringing the Harpes' attention to our families." Martha thought of her own children, 8-year-old Rebecca and 5-year-old James, and felt sick to her stomach. But we can't just do nothing. These are our children, our neighbors' children. My husband tried to do something, Eleanor said, her eyes filling with tears. He was planning to ride to Lexington to report what he'd seen to the authorities there. 2 days later, they found him dead on the road, his neck broken. They said it was an accident, but she shuddered. I know better. The door to the store creaked open, and both women jumped. Thomas Creek stepped inside, his face grim and his clothes muddy from the road. He nodded to the women, but said nothing, moving to the shelves to gather supplies. Martha noticed that his movements were quick and nervous, and he kept glancing toward the windows, as if expecting to see something, or someone, watching. Thomas, Eleanor called softly. Any word about Sarah Jenkins? Thomas paused in his gathering, his shoulders tensing. Her father's organized a search party, he said without turning around. They're heading out toward the old logging trails this afternoon, but he finally turned to face them, and Martha was shocked by the fear she saw in his eyes. But I don't think they're going to find her, not alive anyway. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Martha felt tears prick at her eyes as she thought of little Sarah with her bright smile and infectious laugh. The girl had been playing outside her family's cabin when she vanished, simply there one moment and gone the next, as if the earth had swallowed her whole. There's something else, Thomas continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. I was out checking my traps yesterday, up near the ridge that overlooks the old ranch. I saw smoke coming from the chimney. Someone's been living there, and recently. Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. You didn't go down there, did you? I'm not a fool, Thomas replied grimly. But I watched for a while, long enough to see 2 men moving around the property. Tall, lean men with dark hair, and he paused, swallowing hard. And I heard sounds, crying, like a child crying. The silence that followed was deafening. Martha felt the world spinning around her as the full horror of the situation sank in. The Harpe brothers weren't just stories told around campfires. They were real. They were here, and they had been taking children from their community for months. We have to do something, Martha said, her voice stronger than she felt. We can't just let them continue. What can we do? Eleanor asked desperately. We're farmers and shopkeepers, not soldiers, and if we try to fight them, she gestured helplessly. Look what happened to my husband. Thomas finished gathering his supplies and approached the counter. There might be a way, he said quietly. I've been thinking about this all night. The Harpes are dangerous, yes, but they're also arrogant. They think they're untouchable out here, beyond the reach of any law. That might be their weakness. What do you mean? Martha asked. I mean, we don't try to fight them directly. We gather evidence, real evidence, proof of what they've been doing. Then we take it to the authorities in Lexington, or even Louisville if we have to. Make enough noise that they can't ignore it. Eleanor shook her head. And who's going to gather this evidence? Who's going to get close enough to that ranch to see what's really happening there? Thomas met her gaze steadily. I am. Thomas, no, Martha said immediately. It's too dangerous. If they catch you, if I don't try, more children will disappear, Thomas interrupted. Maybe our children next time. I can't live with that on my conscience. As the 3 of them stood in the dim light of the general store, the weight of their decision settling over them like a heavy blanket, none of them noticed the figure watching from the tree line beyond the settlement. A tall, lean man with dark hair and cold eyes who had been listening to every word of their conversation. Micajah Harpe smiled to himself as he melted back into the shadows of the forest. It seemed the good people of Cedar Hollow were finally beginning to understand the true nature of their situation. But understanding and surviving were 2 very different things, and the Harpe brothers had no intention of allowing their comfortable arrangement to be disturbed. The game was about to begin in earnest. 3 days had passed since the conversation in the general store, and Thomas Creek found himself crouched behind a fallen oak tree, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid morning air. The old Brennan Ranch lay spread out below him in the valley, its weathered buildings casting long shadows across the frost-covered ground. From his vantage point on the ridge, he could see the main house, the barn, and several smaller outbuildings, all connected by a network of muddy paths. Thomas had been watching the ranch for 2 days now, arriving before dawn and staying until well after sunset. He had seen the 2 men Eleanor had mentioned, tall, gaunt figures who moved with the predatory grace of wolves. They came and went at irregular intervals, sometimes disappearing for hours at a time, only to return with bundles slung over their shoulders or leading horses loaded with mysterious cargo. But it was what he had heard that truly chilled him to the bone. On the first night, as darkness settled over the valley like a suffocating blanket, Thomas had crept closer to the ranch buildings. The sounds that drifted up from the main house made his stomach turn, muffled crying, the occasional scream quickly silenced, and worst of all, the sound of children's voices pleading for their mothers. Now, as he watched the ranch through the early morning mist, Thomas saw one of the brothers emerge from the barn. Even at this distance, he could make out the man's distinctive features, the angular face, the long unkempt hair, and the way he moved with casual confidence, as if he owned not just the ranch, but the entire world around it. The man, Thomas was fairly certain it was Micajah, the older of the 2 brothers, walked toward the main house carrying what appeared to be a bucket of water. As he passed one of the smaller outbuildings, Thomas heard a sound that made his blood freeze, the distinct rattle of chains. Thomas pressed himself lower behind the fallen tree, his heart pounding so loudly he was certain it could be heard across the valley. Through his spyglass, he watched as Micajah disappeared into the house, only to emerge moments later with his brother Wiley. The 2 men stood in the yard, engaged in what appeared to be an animated conversation, their gestures sharp and aggressive. Suddenly, Wiley pointed directly toward the ridge where Thomas was hiding. Thomas felt his breath catch in his throat. Had they seen him? He remained perfectly still, not daring to move a muscle, as the 2 brothers continued their discussion. After what felt like an eternity, they separated, Micajah heading toward the barn, while Wiley walked in the direction of the tree line at the base of the ridge. Thomas knew he had to move. If Wiley was coming up the ridge to investigate, he would be discovered within minutes. Carefully, quietly, he began to crawl backward through the underbrush, using the fallen logs and dense vegetation to mask his retreat. Every snapping twig sounded like a gunshot to his ears, every rustle of leaves like a shout announcing his presence. He had made it perhaps 50 yards when he heard the sound of boots on the rocky slope below. Wiley was indeed climbing the ridge, and he was moving with the sure-footed confidence of someone who knew these hills well. Thomas pressed himself against the base of a large pine tree, hardly daring to breathe as the footsteps grew closer. Through the gaps in the pine needles, Thomas caught glimpses of Wiley Harpe as he methodically searched the ridge. The man was younger than his brother, perhaps in his late 20s, but his eyes held the same cold, predatory gleam. He carried a long rifle with practiced ease, and Thomas noticed that his clothes were stained with what looked suspiciously like dried blood. Wiley paused not 10 feet from Thomas's hiding place, his head cocked as if listening for something. For a terrifying moment, their eyes almost met through the pine boughs, and Thomas was certain he had been discovered. But then a sound from the valley below, Micajah calling his brother's name, drew Wiley's attention away. "Nothing up here but squirrels," Wiley called back, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp morning air. "Probably just heard the wind in the trees." Thomas remained frozen in place for another 20 minutes after Wiley had descended back to the ranch, not trusting that the man had truly given up his search. When he finally dared to move, his muscles were cramped and stiff from the cold and tension. He made his way carefully back through the forest, taking a circuitous route that would bring him to the main road well away from the ranch. As he walked, Thomas's mind raced with what he had witnessed. The chains, the sounds of children crying, the brothers' obvious paranoia about being watched. It all painted a picture more horrifying than anything he had imagined, but he still needed proof, something concrete that he could take to the authorities. The sun was high overhead by the time Thomas reached the outskirts of Cedar Hollow. As he approached the settlement, he noticed an unusual commotion near the Jenkins family cabin. A crowd had gathered in the yard, and he could hear the sound of a woman weeping. His heart sank as he realized what this meant. Martha Whitmore saw him approaching and hurried to meet him, her face pale and drawn. "Thomas," she said, her voice barely controlled. "They found Sarah." "Where?" Thomas asked, though he dreaded the answer. "About 2 miles downstream from the old mill," Martha replied, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Some hunters found her this morning. She was—" Martha's voice broke. "She was in a terrible state, Thomas, barely alive. They've taken her to Doc Morrison's, but he doesn't think she'll make it through the night." Thomas felt a cold rage building in his chest. Did she say anything about who took her or where she'd been? Martha nodded, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "She kept saying something about the bad men in the old house, and she mentioned chains, Thomas. She said there were other children there chained up in the dark." The confirmation of what Thomas had suspected hit him like a physical blow. "We have to get her to tell us more," he said urgently. "If she can give us details about the ranch, about what she saw—" "She's dying, Thomas," Martha interrupted. "Doc Morrison says she's been hurt in ways that—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but Thomas understood. The implications made him feel sick. "Then we have to act fast," Thomas said grimly, "before they realize she escaped and move their operation somewhere else." As if summoned by his words, a commotion erupted from the direction of Doc Morrison's cabin. They could hear shouting, the sound of running feet, and then a woman's anguished scream that seemed to go on forever. Martha closed her eyes, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "She's gone," she whispered. Thomas stood in the middle of the settlement, surrounded by the grief and fear of his neighbors, and felt a determination unlike anything he had ever experienced. Sarah Jenkins had died without being able to tell them everything she knew, but she had given them enough. The Harpe brothers were using the old ranch as a base for their horrific crimes, and there were other children still trapped there. As the sun began to set over the Kentucky hills, casting long shadows across the settlement, Thomas made a decision that would change everything. He was going back to the ranch, but this time he wouldn't be content to simply watch from a distance. This time he was going to get inside. But as Thomas walked toward his cabin to gather the supplies he would need for his dangerous mission, he didn't notice the figure watching him from the edge of the forest. Micajah Harpe had been in the settlement all afternoon, moving through the shadows like a ghost, listening to the conversations and learning exactly how much the townspeople knew about his activities. The death of the Jenkins girl was unfortunate. Wiley had been careless in his handling of her, but it was also an opportunity. The people of Cedar Hollow were scared now, which meant they would be easier to manipulate. And if Thomas Creek was planning to play the hero, well, Micajah had dealt with heroes before. As darkness fell over the settlement, Micajah melted back into the forest, already planning his next move. The game was becoming more interesting by the day, and he had no intention of losing. The moon was nothing more than a silver crescent hanging in the star-filled sky when Thomas Creek made his way through the forest toward the old Brennan Ranch. He had waited until well past midnight to begin his approach, knowing that the Harpe brothers would likely be asleep, or at least less vigilant than during the daylight hours. In his pack, he carried rope, a small lantern, his hunting knife, and a loaded pistol that he prayed he wouldn't have to use. The temperature had dropped significantly since sunset, and Thomas's breath formed ghostly clouds as he picked his way carefully through the underbrush. Every sound seemed amplified in the stillness, the crack of a twig underfoot, the rustle of dead leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. He had made this journey twice before during his surveillance, but tonight felt different. Tonight, he wasn't just watching, he was going in. As he crested the ridge overlooking the ranch, Thomas paused to study the buildings below. The main house was dark, with no light visible in any of the windows. The barn and outbuildings were similarly quiet, their shapes barely visible in the pale moonlight. But Thomas had learned to be suspicious of apparent tranquility where the Harpe brothers were concerned. He made his way down the slope with infinite care, testing each step before committing his full weight. The last thing he needed was to trigger a rock slide or step into a hidden hole that would announce his presence to anyone within a mile. It took him nearly an hour to cover the distance that would normally require only 10 minutes of walking. When he reached the edge of the ranch property, Thomas crouched behind a low stone wall that had once marked the boundary of a vegetable garden. From here, he could see the details of the buildings more clearly. The main house was a two-story structure with a wraparound porch, its paint peeling and several windows boarded up. The barn was larger than he had realized from his distant observations, with what appeared to be several additions built onto the original structure. But it was the smaller outbuildings that drew his attention. There were 3 of them, arranged in a rough semicircle behind the main house. They looked like they might have once been used for storage or as workshops, but something about them seemed wrong. The windows were not just boarded up, they had been sealed with heavy planks and what looked like iron bars. Thomas studied the buildings for several minutes, trying to determine the best approach. The crying sounds he had heard during his previous surveillance had seemed to come from the direction of these smaller structures. If there were children being held captive, this was where he would find them. He was about to move when a sound from the main house froze him in place. A door had opened, and he could see a tall figure silhouetted against the faint light from within. One of the brothers, Thomas couldn't tell which one in the darkness, stepped onto the porch and stood there for a long moment, as if listening to the night sounds. Thomas pressed himself lower behind the stone wall, hardly daring to breathe. The figure on the porch seemed to be looking directly at his hiding place, and for a terrifying moment, Thomas was certain he had been discovered. But then, the man turned and walked to the far end of the porch, where he relieved himself off the side before returning to the house. The door closed with a soft thud, and darkness reclaimed the ranch. Thomas waited another 10 minutes before moving, wanting to be absolutely certain that the brother had returned to bed. When he finally crept forward, he chose a path that would take him around the main house at the widest possible distance, using the barn and other structures to block any view from the windows. The first outbuilding he approached was the smallest of the 3, little more than a shed with a single door and no windows. As he drew closer, Thomas caught a smell that made his stomach turn, a mixture of unwashed bodies, human waste, and something else he couldn't identify, but that spoke of suffering and despair. The door was secured with a heavy wooden bar and what appeared to be a new padlock. Thomas examined the lock by feel, running his fingers over the metal to determine its size and construction. It was substantial, but not impossible to break if he could find the right tool. He was about to move on to examine the other buildings when he heard it, a soft whimpering sound from inside the shed. The sound was so quiet he almost missed it, but once he heard it, he couldn't ignore it. Someone was in there, someone alive and in distress. Thomas pressed his ear to the door, straining to hear more. The whimpering continued, occasionally punctuated by what sounded like whispered words, though he couldn't make them out clearly. His heart raced as he realized he was probably listening to one of the missing children. He moved to the second building, which was larger and appeared to have been divided into multiple rooms. This structure had several small, barred windows set high in the walls, and as Thomas approached one of them, he caught the sound of breathing. Multiple people breathing in the confined space. The third building was the largest of the 3, and as Thomas circled it, he discovered something that made his blood run cold. On the side, facing away from the main house, there was a small pile of what looked like children's clothing, torn, dirty, and stained with substances he didn't want to identify. Thomas felt a rage building inside him, unlike anything he had ever experienced. The evidence of what was happening here was overwhelming, but he needed to see more, to gather proof that would convince the authorities to act swiftly and decisively. He returned to the first building and examined the padlock more carefully. Using his hunting knife, he was able to work the blade into the gap between the lock and the hasp, applying pressure until the screws holding the hasp began to loosen. It was slow, careful work, and every small sound seemed deafeningly loud in the night silence. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, Thomas managed to work the hasp loose enough to lift the wooden bar. His hands were shaking as he slowly, quietly, pulled the door open just wide enough to slip inside. The smell hit him immediately, a nauseating mixture of human misery and fear. As his eyes adjusted to the deeper darkness inside the shed, Thomas could make out a small figure huddled in the far corner. It was a child, a girl who looked to be perhaps 7 or 8 years old, chained to a ring set into the wall. "Don't hurt me," the child whispered, her voice hoarse and terrified. "Please don't hurt me anymore." Thomas's heart broke as he knelt beside her, keeping his voice as gentle as possible. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said softly. "I'm here to help." "What's your name?" The girl looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. Even in the darkness, Thomas could see that she had been badly mistreated. Her clothes were torn and filthy, her hair matted, and there were bruises visible on her arms and face. "Lucy," she whispered. "Lucy Morrison. I want to go home. I want my mama." Thomas felt tears prick at his eyes. Lucy Morrison had disappeared from a settlement nearly 30 miles away, almost 2 months ago. Her family had probably given her up for dead by now. "I'm going to get you out of here, Lucy," Thomas promised, examining the chain that held her. It was secured with another padlock, this one smaller than the one on the door, but still substantial. "But I need you to be very quiet. Can you do that?" Lucy nodded, hope flickering in her eyes for the first time since Thomas had entered the shed. As Thomas worked on the lock, Lucy whispered urgently, "There are others, in the other buildings. And sometimes they take us to the big house," and she shuddered, unable to continue. "How many others?" Thomas asked, his hands working steadily on the lock. "I don't know. They move us around. Sometimes there are new ones, sometimes—" She trailed off, but Thomas understood. Sometimes children disappeared entirely, and he didn't want to think about what that meant. The lock finally gave way with a soft click that sounded like thunder to Thomas's ears. He quickly freed Lucy from the chain and helped her to her feet, noting that she was weak and unsteady. "Can you walk?" he asked. "I think so," Lucy replied, though her voice was uncertain. Thomas was about to lead her toward the door when he heard the sound that had been haunting his nightmares, the creak of the main house door opening. Through the crack in the shed door, he could see a light moving across the yard, growing brighter as someone approached with a lantern. "Hide!" Thomas whispered urgently to Lucy, pushing her behind a pile of old sacks in the corner of the shed. "Don't make a sound, no matter what happens." Thomas pressed himself against the wall beside the door, his hand gripping the handle of his hunting knife. Through the crack, he could see the lantern light growing closer, and he could hear heavy footsteps on the hard-packed earth of the yard. The footsteps stopped directly outside the shed. "Well, well," came a voice that Thomas recognized as belonging to Micajah Harpe. "What do we have here?" The door swung open and lantern light flooded the small space. Thomas found himself face to face with the most dangerous man on the Kentucky frontier, and he knew that his mission to gather evidence had just become a fight for survival. Micajah Harpe stood in the doorway of the shed, his lantern casting dancing shadows across his gaunt features. In the flickering light, his face looked almost demonic, all sharp angles and hollow cheeks, with eyes that seemed to reflect the flame like a predator's. He was taller than Thomas had expected, probably 6.5 feet, with long, unkempt hair that hung past his shoulders and clothes that bore the stains of unspeakable acts. Thomas Creek, Micajah said, his voice carrying a tone of mild amusement. I was wondering when you'd work up the courage to pay us a proper visit. Thomas felt his blood turn to ice. The fact that Micajah knew his name meant that the brothers had been watching the settlement far more closely than anyone had realized. His hand tightened on his knife, though he knew it would be little use against the rifle that Micajah held casually in his other hand. Surprised, Micajah continued, stepping into the shed and forcing Thomas to back against the wall. You really didn't think you could spy on us for days without us noticing, did you? My brother Wiley spotted you on that ridge the first morning you showed up. We've been having quite a bit of fun watching you play at being a hero. Behind the pile of sacks, Thomas could hear Lucy's terrified breathing, though she was managing to stay silent as he had instructed. He prayed that Micajah wouldn't notice her, though he suspected that hope was futile. What do you want? Thomas asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Micajah's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass. What do I want? That's a fine question, Thomas. What I want is for people to mind their own business and let me conduct mine in peace. But it seems the good folks of Cedar Hollow have been getting a bit too curious for their own good. People know where I am, Thomas said, though it was a lie. He had told no one of his plan to infiltrate the ranch, knowing they would try to stop him. No, they don't, Micajah replied with certainty. You're the type who thinks he has to save everyone all by himself. Noble, but stupid. Your wife thinks you're out checking your trap lines, and she won't expect you back until tomorrow evening. That gives us plenty of time to get acquainted. Thomas felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. What happened to Sarah Jenkins? Ah, the little Jenkins girl. Micajah's expression grew thoughtful. That was unfortunate. My brother can be overzealous in his enthusiasms. The child was damaged beyond usefulness, so we let her go. We thought she would die in the woods, but apparently she was tougher than she looked. The casual way Micajah spoke about Sarah's suffering made Thomas's vision blur with rage. You're monsters, he said through gritted teeth. Monsters? Micajah seemed genuinely puzzled by the accusation. Thomas, we're businessmen. We provide a service that certain people are willing to pay very well for. The fact that our merchandise occasionally gets damaged is simply the cost of doing business. The implications of Micajah's words hit Thomas like a physical blow. You're selling them, the children. You're selling them to people. Very good, Micajah said approvingly. I was beginning to think you were too stupid to figure it out. Yes, we acquire children from various sources and transport them to buyers who have specific requirements. It's quite lucrative, actually, much more profitable than simple highway robbery. Thomas felt sick to his stomach. He had suspected that the Harpe brothers were holding children captive, but the reality was even worse than he had imagined. They weren't just killers. They were running a slave trade in human children. The authorities will stop you, Thomas said, though his voice lacked conviction. Will they? Micajah asked. And who's going to tell them? You? I don't think so. Your neighbors? They're too frightened to even admit they know what's happening. Face it, Thomas. We're untouchable out here. The nearest law is days away, and by the time any help could arrive, we'd be long gone. As if to emphasize his point, Micajah raised his rifle and pointed it directly at Thomas's chest. But you've created a problem for us, Thomas. You've seen too much, and you know too much. That puts us in a difficult position. Thomas's mind raced, trying to find some way out of the situation. Behind the sacks, he could hear Lucy's breathing becoming more rapid and shallow. The child was terrified and probably close to panic. However, Micajah continued, I'm not an unreasonable man. I'm prepared to offer you a choice. What kind of choice? Micajah's smile was like a knife blade. You can join us, or you can join our inventory. Thomas stared at him in disbelief. You want me to help you kidnap children? I want you to help us expand our operation. Micajah corrected. You know the people in Cedar Hollow. You know their routines, their weaknesses. You could be very useful in identifying suitable merchandise and helping us acquire it without drawing unwanted attention. The suggestion was so monstrous that Thomas couldn't immediately respond. The idea that he would even consider helping these men prey on his own neighbors was beyond comprehension. Think about it, Micajah pressed. Your own children, Rebecca and James, isn't it? They're exactly the type of merchandise our buyers prefer. Young, healthy, unspoiled. If you work with us, they stay safe. If you don't, he shrugged eloquently. The threat to his children cut through Thomas's shock like a blade. You stay away from my family, he said, his voice deadly quiet. That's entirely up to you, Micajah replied. Cooperate and they remain off limits. Refuse and they become our next acquisition. It's really quite simple. Thomas felt trapped between impossible choices. If he agreed to help the Harpe brothers, he would be condemning other children to the fate that had befallen Lucy and Sarah Jenkins. But if he refused, his own children would become targets. I need time to think, Thomas said finally. Of course you do, Micajah agreed. It's a big decision. Tell you what, I'll give you until tomorrow night to make up your mind. That should be plenty of time to consider all the implications. Micajah stepped back toward the door, but then paused as if remembering something. Oh, and Thomas, don't even think about trying to warn anyone or organize some kind of resistance. We have friends in places you wouldn't expect, and we'll know if you try anything foolish. The consequences would be severe. As Micajah turned to leave, his lantern light swept across the pile of sacks where Lucy was hiding. For a moment, Thomas was certain the child would be discovered, but Micajah seemed more interested in making his exit than in searching the shed thoroughly. Tomorrow night, Thomas, Micajah said from the doorway. Don't keep us waiting. The door closed with a soft thud, and Thomas heard the sound of the wooden bar being replaced. He was trapped in the shed with Lucy, but at least they were both still alive. Is he gone? Lucy whispered from behind the sacks. For now, Thomas replied, though he knew their situation was far from resolved. Micajah had given him an impossible choice, and he had less than 24 hours to find a third option. One that would save both his family and the other children being held captive at the ranch. As he helped Lucy out from her hiding place, Thomas's mind was already working on a plan. It was dangerous, probably suicidal, but it might be their only chance. He just hoped he could convince the people of Cedar Hollow to take a stand before it was too late. Outside the shed, the Kentucky night seemed darker than ever. And somewhere in that darkness, the Harpe brothers were planning their next move in a game where the stakes were measured in innocent lives. The first pale light of dawn was creeping over the Kentucky hills when Thomas Creek and Lucy Morrison finally made their way back to Cedar Hollow. They had spent the remainder of the night hiding in the forest, waiting for the right moment to slip away from the ranch undetected. Lucy was weak and exhausted, but her determination to reach safety had kept her moving through the difficult terrain. As they approached the settlement, Thomas could see that something was wrong. Smoke was rising from several locations, and there was an unusual amount of activity for such an early hour. People were moving between the buildings with urgent purpose, and he could hear the sound of voices raised in alarm. Martha Whitmore was the first to spot them as they emerged from the tree line. She ran toward them, her face a mixture of relief and terror. Thomas, thank God you're alive. We thought... She stopped short when she saw Lucy, her eyes widening in recognition. Lucy Morrison, child, we thought you were dead. What's happening here? Thomas asked, noting the fear in Martha's voice. They came in the night, Martha said, her voice shaking. The Harpe brothers. They took 3 children, the Patterson twins and little Michael Webb. But that's not the worst of it. She paused, struggling to control her emotions. They left a message. They said if we don't hand you over by sunset, they'll start killing the children they've taken. One every hour until you surrender yourself. Thomas felt the world spinning around him. His worst fears had been realized. By trying to rescue the captive children, he had only made the situation worse. Now more children were in danger because of his actions. "There's more," Martha continued. "Eleanor Brennan is dead. They found her this morning in her store, her throat cut, and there's a note pinned to her dress that says, 'This is what happens to those who talk too much.'" The news hit Thomas like a physical blow. Eleanor had been killed because she had shared information about the Harpe brothers with him and Martha. Her death was on his conscience, along with the danger now facing the newly captured children. "We have to do something," Thomas said, though he wasn't sure what that could be. "Some of the men are talking about forming a posse," Martha replied, "but most are too frightened. The Harpes have made it clear that anyone who opposes them will face the same fate as Eleanor." Thomas looked around the settlement, noting the fear in people's faces as they went about their morning routines. These were good people, farmers, shopkeepers, craftsmen, but they weren't fighters. They had come to the frontier to build new lives, not to wage war against monsters like the Harpe brothers. "Where are they meeting?" Thomas asked. "At the church," Martha replied. "But Thomas, you can't seriously be thinking of turning yourself over to them." "I don't see that I have much choice," Thomas said grimly. "This is my fault. If I hadn't tried to play the hero, those children would still be safe." "And how many more would have disappeared?" Martha countered. "At least now we know what we're dealing with. At least now we have a chance to fight back." Thomas wasn't so sure about that, but he knew he had to try. He couldn't live with himself if children died because of his actions. The church was a simple wooden structure at the center of the settlement, and when Thomas arrived, he found about 20 men gathered inside. They were a mix of ages and occupations, but they all shared the same grim expression of men who had been pushed beyond their limits. Samuel Whitmore, Martha's husband, stood at the front of the group. He was a large man, a blacksmith by trade, with hands that could bend iron and a voice that could carry across a field. When he saw Thomas enter, his expression grew even more serious. "Thomas," Samuel said, "we've been discussing the situation. The way we see it, we have 3 choices. We can hand you over to the Harpes and hope they keep their word about releasing the children. We can try to mount a rescue operation, or we can pack up and abandon the settlement entirely." "What's the consensus?" Thomas asked. "Split pretty evenly between the first 2 options," Samuel replied. "Nobody wants to abandon their homes, but nobody wants to see children die either." Thomas looked around the room at the faces of his neighbors. Men he had known for years, men whose children played with his own children, men who had helped him build his cabin and clear his fields. They were looking to him for leadership, but he felt utterly unprepared for the responsibility. "What do we know about their current position?" Thomas asked. "They're still at the old ranch," replied James Patterson, whose twin sons had been taken in the night raid. "My boy Billy managed to escape during the confusion and made it home about an hour ago. He says they've got all the children locked up in the barn now, and they're taking turns guarding them." Thomas felt a spark of hope. If the children were all in one location, it might be possible to mount a coordinated rescue attempt. But it would be incredibly dangerous, and there was no guarantee of success. "How many men are we talking about?" Thomas asked. "Just the 2 brothers?" "Billy says he saw at least 4 men," Patterson replied. "The Harpes have picked up some associates, apparently, and they're all armed with rifles." The odds were getting worse by the minute. 20 farmers and shopkeepers against 4 experienced killers was not a battle Thomas wanted to fight, especially with children's lives hanging in the balance. "There might be another way," said a voice from the back of the room. Everyone turned to see Doc Morrison, the settlement's physician, stepping forward. He was an older man, probably in his 60s, with gray hair and a lined face that spoke of years spent dealing with human suffering. "What do you have in mind, Doc?" Samuel asked. "I've been thinking about this all night," Morrison said. "The Harpes are confident because they think they hold all the cards. They have the children, they have superior firepower, and they think we're too scared to fight back. But they've made one crucial mistake." "Which is?" Thomas asked. "They've underestimated us," Morrison replied. "They think we're just simple farmers who will roll over at the first sign of trouble. They don't realize that some of us have experience with this kind of situation." Morrison paused, looking around the room. "I wasn't always a frontier doctor," he continued. "Before I came to Kentucky, I served as a military surgeon during the Indian Wars. I've seen combat, and I know how men like the Harpes think." This was news to Thomas and most of the other men in the room. Doc Morrison had always seemed like a gentle, scholarly man, not someone with a military background. "What are you suggesting?" Samuel asked. "I'm suggesting we use their confidence against them," Morrison replied. "They're expecting us to either surrender, Thomas, or mount a clumsy frontal assault. They won't be prepared for a coordinated attack using proper military tactics." Thomas felt a glimmer of hope for the first time since the crisis had begun. "What kind of tactics?" Morrison moved to the front of the room and began sketching a rough map of the ranch on a piece of paper. "The key is to divide their attention and attack from multiple directions simultaneously. If we can create enough confusion, we might be able to reach the children before the Harpes can harm them." For the next hour, Morrison outlined his plan in detail. It was complex and dangerous, requiring precise timing and coordination, but it offered the best chance of success they were likely to get. The men listened intently, asking questions and offering suggestions, and gradually a sense of purpose began to replace the fear and uncertainty that had dominated the morning. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the men of Cedar Hollow prepared for what might be their final battle. They cleaned their weapons, said goodbye to their families, and tried to prepare themselves mentally for what lay ahead. Some would not be coming home, but they all understood that the alternative, allowing the Harpe brothers to continue their reign of terror, was unacceptable. Thomas spent the final hours before the assault writing letters to his wife and children, trying to find words to express his love and his regret that he might not be there to watch them grow up. But he also tried to explain why he had to take this risk, why some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed impossible. As the sun began to set over the Kentucky hills, painting the sky in shades of red and gold, the men of Cedar Hollow mounted their horses and rode toward their destiny. Behind them, their families watched from doorways and windows, praying for their safe return and knowing that the next few hours would determine the fate of their community. At the old Brennan Ranch, the Harpe brothers were making their own preparations, confident that the cowardly farmers would deliver Thomas Creek as promised. They had no idea that 20 determined men were approaching through the gathering darkness, ready to fight for the lives of their children and the future of their settlement. The final confrontation was about to begin, and only one side would see the dawn. As the riders disappeared into the forest, Martha Whitmore clutched her shawl tighter and whispered a prayer into the Kentucky night. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, her husband and neighbors were riding toward a battle that would either free the captive children or destroy everything they had worked to build. The outcome would be decided before morning, and the hills of Kentucky would remember this night for generations to come.